Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let Dr. Holland Sims introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Dr. Nicole Holland Sims. I'm an educational consultant with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, otherwise known as PATN or PATAN, out of the Harrisburg office. I'm also currently serving as the special advisor to the Department of Education around equity.
I'm Dr. Dana Milakovic. I'm the mental health, alcohol, and other drug specialist with the Office for Safe Schools with PDE. And I also serve as the trauma lead for the Department of Education. And we are so excited that you're joining us today as we talk about how we manage leader and student morale in our current online or hybrid models and moving into next year. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. We will have a question and answer session at the end, and we look forward to your feedback and your questions.
So, one of the things we're hoping to do in this session is to really think about the newness that we had to take on as a result of COVID-19 and how education, in particular teaching and learning, has been reimagined in either hybrid models or online formats. And we want to think about how we can assist teachers around their own morale and well being, because we know you can't pour from an empty cup. And with that same morale boost, how do we boost the morale of our students that are also navigating very different waters and figuring out how education looks and sounds and feels like for them? Our hope for today is to provide some concrete ways of how virtual communities can be built, how relationships can be enhanced, and just generally supporting the mental wellness of educators and students. And we think it's important for administrators in particular to hear this as you wear a very important hat, and we want to secure your oxygen mask as well.
I am obviously struggling with Zoom today. Sorry, it is a Monday. So as Nicole said, we really do want to think about how we are creating safe environments that support our staff. Anyone from our administrators to our educators to our support staff, anyone who walks into the school building. We have all been in a very unique situation for the last year, but we know that while this last year has been unique, for educators is not new. One of the, I'm going to borrow Nicole's saying, opportunities that came out of this pandemic is really thinking about how we have come to think about mental health, how we've come to think about positive learning environments and self-care. And one of the things that started pre-pandemic and now has really come full circle has been this idea of creating positive learning environments. And so when we think about how we create a positive learning environment that is safe for everybody, we think about embedding trauma-informed care values into them. So today we're going to discuss how these trauma-informed care core values, which is a mouthful, can really be embedded into the school setting, whether you're hybrid, in person, virtual. And the values we're going to discuss today are safety, trustworthiness, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, choice and voice, and cultural sensitivity. And one of the things as we move forward that's really important that Nicole and I both talk about a lot is that these are not something new that you do. This isn't an initiative. It's not something that you do on the side after you're teaching or when you're doing behavior management or if you're in an MTSS system. This is really a lens as to which we look at every single thing we do from the moment we start interacting with staff to interacting with students to discipline, procedures, grading, everything that we do in a school setting. So when we think about safety, we automatically, especially in the pandemic world, think physical safety. Where are we with our barriers? Are we setting up our environment? Are we making sure that everyone is physically safe? But physical safety is more than that. It's how do we teach students to set up their environment so they feel physically safe, so that this can be anything from I'm not comfortable having people behind me, so I need to ask to be sitting in the back of the back of the classroom, to if I'm in a bullying situation, how do I physically set myself up to feel safe? When we're in an online setting, this can be, what does my online safety look like? What does my digital citizenship look like? And from a safety aspect, it's really important to realize that when we're thinking online, many of our students are the experts in their homes. So We don't have parents who necessarily know that they're engaged in safe behavior online. They may not be being monitored. So teaching that is really important. When we think about emotional safety, how do we set developmentally appropriate boundaries? Thinking about when I'm online or I'm virtual, how do I maintain the norms that I have already established with my students or that I would do in a typical classroom to the greatest extent possible? And really focusing on that connections, making sure that there are planned touch points so that you can make sure you have a connection with your student, whether you ever see them in person or not. And then I really love this idea that has come out around emotional safety of heart monitors, kind of these short messages or questions, and they act as if they're like morning messages. So if you were in person and you would do a morning message to really look at that connection or promote relationship building, these are the idea of how do we do this virtually? How do we do this in a hybrid model? How do we consistently keep what we've been doing in our school setting so that our students feel emotionally connected? And then behavioral safety, really looking at whether I'm virtual or I'm hybrid or I'm in person, making sure that behaviors are defined as this is what's expected, this is what's okay, this is how we keep everyone safe. And then academic safety, we know that our students are struggling right now. While they haven't necessarily academically gone backwards, they're struggling with stress. They're struggling with what's happening in their environment, uncertainty, the same stresses that our educators are struggling with as well. And so we often hear this idea of like a backslide. But what I really want you to think about, and I encourage you to think about as we're moving forward, is how do we think about academic safety and knowing, hey, I know what you're going through and I'm going to support you academically. I know that you're having a rough time, so we're going to support you with more scaffolding. I'm really thinking about that as a safety measure. And then social safety, just really thinking about the way that you socially interact with your peers and also that how your students socially interact with each other.
And so, one of the things that we did definitely wanted to provide you today are those examples. And so, Dana was able to just very nicely just now give you some of those examples and how you can really be cognizant about how you're approaching students in particular. So, as we're thinking about safety, again, some examples that I was able to glean from our PBIS world. So, if you go to pbis.org, there's a resource that talks about coming back from crisis. And it was just recently updated this month to really highlight that there are a lot of schools that are returning now to whether it's brick or mortar or just their typical routines. And so some examples of safety would be inviting young or vulnerable students to resume school early. So this may be a week ahead of the start date, having students that would be deemed their most vulnerable. So the eye of the beholder is what deems vulnerability in your particular context. But in typical situations, it would be students that have significant emotional needs, significant disabilities, or significant age. So when we say young, just being accustomed to even walking into a school building, I can think of my now 3-year old when he's 5. What will that look like for him when he has to figure out how to navigate a school space? So inviting younger vulnerable students to really get that kind of jump start early can be a way to create a safe space. Also, positive greetings at the door. If you've been on any type of social media as an educator, you'll see some cool videos of teachers that are interacting with their students in a way that creates a space. As soon as they come in, it's a high five, it's a, hey, Nicole, how are you? Using my name, letting me know you know me. And just being able to modify those as a way, as an approach to ensure that each student starts off their day with a positive interaction and that there's a quick daily check in so that not only are you creating a positive interaction for them, but also knowing what they may be walking in with that you may have to navigate throughout that school day. And as you're thinking about this on an online platform or in an online space, adapting or modifying that could be as simple as when they walk in, this is, or log in rather, this is what we're talking about. Some additional examples would be lessons learned during remote learning. So, again, if you had regular check ins when COVID first hit, that you were checking in with students or checking in with families of younger students, continuing that, even when we resume some type of what we would deem normal approaches to education, would be important. And then prioritizing opportunities for students to use language throughout the day. So they've missed some of that social interaction time. So how do you build that in to the structure of your day so that they have the chance to connect and also to develop their oral language? And so in online spaces, this may be the chat feature, it could be Padlet, it could be Mentimeter, all those ways of ensuring communication.
The next value we want to talk about is trustworthiness. One of the things that we hear a lot right now is that we need to assume everyone has been traumatized by the pandemic and the social unrest that has been occurring across the United States. And so, what I would say to that is that everyone has been exposed to trauma, and that is really, really important. So, it isn't our role necessarily to figure out who's been traumatized and who has not. Our role is to create this space where everyone can feel that they can heal and that they can move forward. So when we think about that, trustworthiness is a huge component of that. When we have families who have already experienced trauma, even at an individual level, but especially at a system level. So think about your families that you struggled to connect with in the past, even when you were in person. They didn't want to come into meetings. They may not do parent teacher conferences. They may not respond to your communications. We sometimes think about those parents as, well, they must not want to be involved. And what I would invite you to think about is maybe they have their own trauma experience. And so when we're traumatized, what we learn is that we can't trust. We can't trust people we don't know, and we certainly cannot trust systems. So, creating trustworthiness and creating an environment where you do what you say you're going to do. When we put out our initial communications about how to create environments, this was in there in our communication plan for our staff and student wellness guide under we don't know all the answers. This changes day to day. We have no control over the pandemic at all. Like, this is a non-controllable thing for all of us, which is driving administrators crazy, understandably. But we want to recognize that it's okay to say to people, we don't know all the answers, but we're going to work with you. And that creates that trustworthiness. So, really being honest, really being transparent, being reliable, having consistent communication, making sure you're connecting with students and your community, because the community is the one who is really supporting families right now. So, as we think about that student, family, teacher, community connection, that is a vital part of how we're going to move forward and reduce the stress on our education system and also take advantage of what has been happening in our communities to really build partnerships. And then normalizing the nuances of virtual learning. When we all started this, there was a lot of stress. And I think for the most part, that stress has reduced in the aspect of how do I even create a virtual classroom? How do I even create a Zoom room? How do I even connect with anyone? Educators have come so far so fast. Like, you have just picked it up and run with it and done everything that you needed to do to support your students. And now we want to think about how you take care of yourself, and how you give yourself some grace and some understanding when things don't go well. And think about that as your virtual learning environment. And then also, when we're thinking trustworthiness, honoring private chats. We want to teach our students to private chat us. We want them to be able to say, I need help. I can't do X, Y, or Z. This is bothering me. And the way we do that is through private chat. So making sure that we're honoring that and being aware when something comes through, is this an everyone chat or is this a private chat, is a vital part of that trustworthiness.
Definitely. And thinking about creating a trustworthy space, some of the things that I hearken back to would be current events. So in a lot of our classrooms, whether they've been virtual or regular type general classrooms that we're accustomed to, there are conversations that our students want us to have. And in building that trustworthy space, we have to know how we as individuals can do that. So, Learning for Justice, which was formerly Teaching Tolerance, created a 4-step guide on how to really take ownership when bad things happen of your classroom, of how to have conversations. And the reason it's titled that is because it comes out of things like if there's a mass shooting, if there's civil unrest, if there is any type of trauma that universally impacts a large group. And Dana just articulated that the pandemic has been traumatizing for all of us in some way. So how do we create that trustworthy space? So there's 4 steps. Number 1 is to listen. It sounds easy enough, but sometimes when we have students in front of us, listening to what it is that they want to talk about and not being afraid to engage in those conversations. So I'm going to touch on an example very briefly, and that is the insurrection on January 6th. There were a lot of staff members who really were uncomfortable and unsure of how to have conversations if students brought it up. And so as we think about these 4 steps, when it's a little bit testy, these are things we can keep in mind. So listening to what students wish to talk about and allowing them the space to do so. Number 2 is modeling. So modeling for them what is verified news, what is potentially not so much verified news, and how do you navigate that space to ensure that what you're getting through the media is able to be discussed in a very appropriate way. Number 3 is to protect. So protecting students from those harmful discussions that might lead to bias statements, etc. How do you protect students and create a space where they can engage effectively? And then number 4 is to take care of yourself. Everyone comes from varying backgrounds and perspectives. And so you may have a very strong opinion about what may be being discussed or how students understand certain things. So being able to take inventory of yourself on where you stand, and are you able to have that conversation by yourself, or do you need a partner in this effort if the conversation does come up? That leads to trustworthiness for not only yourself, but also the students that are entering your space. Next slide.
You want to take care of number 4?
Yep, I did.
I missed it. This
It's
is what I'm
okay.
saying. We're gonna give yourself like a thing because I am having a moment today. Okay, and then collaboration and mutuality. One of the things that we think about when we're creating trauma-informed equitable systems is we really want to think about how we level that power difference so that we're not always making the decision. And what happens like naturally when we are stressed is we either do one of two things. We turn to someone else and we want them to make all the decisions, or we go into this, oh my gosh, I can't control what's happening around me, so I will take everything that I can control and I will make everyone listen to me. And when we're thinking about how we share this power with students, we have to understand that we can do this in person, virtually, or hybrid. So how we do that is thinking about things even as simple as how we're going to structure our day. We're doing math. Do we do this assignment first or that assignment first? Which one do we look at? Do you raise your hand by picking a choice of icons from the bottom of your Zoom platform, or do you put it in chat? How do we create classroom messaging? These are things that you can do that really share that power difference. And while they are little things, they are not things that are going to change your grading policies or behavior expectations. They give students a feeling of power, and they reduce that need to have that power struggle back and forth where everyone is feeling overwhelmed. It also allows them to have a voice, and it is relationship focused. We're doing it so that we can develop that reciprocal relationship so that students feel heard. So administrators, your staff feels heard when you're making those decisions together. It's really creating a relationship between all aspects of the community, the family, the students, and the school system, and really sharing that power all together. You can look at breakout rooms for shared connections. These are some examples, and Nicole's going to go into a bunch more, but really thinking about what the norms are that include that shared power view.
So I love that, Dana and I have been intentional about employing the trauma informed care values because, again, this is bringing about consistency for students, whether they've had a traumatic experience or not, and allows for that space to be extremely supportive of all. And that's what we want with equity. So these are examples, again, of collaboration and mutuality. And as we're thinking about the work that I've showcased around PBIS, it's important for those consistent behavioral expectations to be taught and explained across all environments. So whether again you're hybrid, virtual, or in person, those expectations should be co-constructed, if you will, with not only you as staff members, but also getting student input. I know at the secondary level, student input is so critical. And we say student voice all the time, but what does that really mean? Are we listening or are we just providing a platform for them? And so those expectations need to reflect the needs of those students, but also supporting the overall climate of the system. We also talk about differentiating explicit and systematic instruction. And so, in providing that explicit instruction, that speaks again to being consistent and clear and transparent to create a trustworthy space. So, I know what's expected of me, I know what you need from me from the instructional delivery. And that's something as simple as providing learning intentions. What are the things you want me to gain from this lesson? And that would also speak to integrating key social emotional practices into learning. So often, when we think of social emotional learning, we see it as a time that's with the counselor during this period. And what we want to do is get away from that and allow for social emotional practices to be embedded into everything that we do. Because what we know to be true and what we've seen in research is that when it lives with one person, let's say the counselor or just one teacher, those skills don't translate to all of the other classrooms because it's seen as just living in that one space. So the integration of those practices is critical. Next slide. And so, as we consider student engagement, how do we keep students wanting to be a part of our educational communities? This work comes out of the University of Minnesota and Check and Connect. And so, if you take a look at the subtypes of student engagement, I think it's always interesting to note that there are multiple. It's not just who's raising their hand or saying an answer. Engagement is a little deeper than that. And so, as we look at those subtypes in general, academic and behavioral are things that we can outwardly see. So, for instance, time on task, whether they've earned their credits, if they're attending, if they don't have suspensions, if they're participating, those are academic and behavioral. One of the key components that students reported as reasons for them to drop out was that they didn't feel that they belonged in school. And that speaks to the last two. That type of engagement is not very observable. It's the connection to school, it's the want to be there, and it's cognitive and affective. So, do I find relevance in the schoolwork? Do I think about my own thinking? Am I self regulated around the goals that I set for myself from an educational lens? The goal of education is to create self regulated learners. Do I identify with the school setting? Do I have a sense of belonging where I can be my authentic self when I walk into this door? And do I have a connection with teachers and peers? And so, as we think about boosting student morale in particular, these subtypes of engagement are so important to ensure that we're not just looking at the things we see, but the things that are beneath the surface that ensure that there's a connection.
One of the things that we think about, as Nicole said, when we think about that connection, that feeling safe, that wanting to be there, that feeling engaged, is do students feel like they have a voice in school? So empowerment, choice, and voice is so important. And I know that districts I work with are so tired of hearing me say relationships, relationships, relationships. But that is what this is about. It is about focusing your relationships on a strength focus, looking at how we build relationships from a superintendent to administrators, a superintendent to educators, administrators to educators, educators to families, educators to students, and educators to themselves. It's really thinking about how do we provide that space where everyone feels like they are empowered to do the best they can do, they're empowered to heal, and they're empowered to succeed. So for staff, that really, thinks about training. What are our staff development needs? Are we developing professional development plans that are just based on a checklist, or are we really thinking about this is what our staff needs? Our staff needs us to do X, Y, and Z, so we're going to modify how we fit this in. We're going to make sure that we're providing the training so our staff feels empowered to do what they need to do. Do our policies and procedures really reflect expectations for all settings? Are we thinking about, when we're developing policies and procedures, how we make our students feel safe and included? Are we including that voice from families? Are we including that voice from our students and our staff when we're creating our policies and our procedures and our daily practices so that they have the ability to feel like they are part of the system? This ties very closely with the mutuality and the collaboration, because they really all go together. And that's what we mean when we say it's a lens, because you can't just pick one out and say, oh, we're doing this right now. It's really all together. And the polls, the games, the online platforms, again, tie back into all the examples Nicole has given in the past of how we include students, how we can engage them, and how we can make them feel included and safe in our environment. And then thinking about when we're doing meetings, this one isn't necessarily around students. Previously, we talked about group norms when we were thinking about classroom settings, but if we change our focus a little bit and we think about our meetings, what do we have as norms around participation for our staffing when we're having meetings online? When we're doing meetings in person, we all have norms. When we're in person, we all know what the norms are. We know what those little hidden rules are in our environment. But when we move to a virtual setting, it can be different. We can kind of slide into not having those norms. And so setting them up front can be really important to make sure that we're all feeling included and safe as well.
And so that really speaks to cultural sensitivity. So everyone comes at this work and to educational spaces from different backgrounds and perspectives. And so those setting of foundational agreements or norms cannot be understated, because that helps everyone to kind of understand what the expectations are consistently across settings. So one of the things that we talk about with cultural sensitivity is this process of being responsive and being humble enough to take on understanding of difference. So it's not just enough to have diversity. You have to be able to be inclusive of that diversity and also provide equity so that people that explain their experience or have a different experience have the opportunity to be respected and responded to in an appropriate way. So, as this kind of speaks to morale around not only students but also families, would be customizable profile names. So, you'll see on Dana's and on mine the she, her, and hers. If students want to do that, being willing and open enough to create the safe space for that to happen. Communicating with families while considering background language and culture. So, one of the things that I've learned from the NYU Center, the Metro Center on Equity and Inclusion, is this concept around culturally responsive and sustaining family engagement. And what they talk about is how important it is that we communicate in the way that families want. And so often we go to, as a school setting, well, we just send out an email blast and we've done our due diligence, or we put it on the web and we've done our due diligence. Some parents prefer to be texted. Some parents prefer to just look at the web. Some parents prefer a phone call. So it's taking inventory of what your families want in the mode of communication. And that's being cognizant of their language. That's being cognizant of their culture, which in some cultures may see the school as the end all be all, the all knowing. And so oftentimes they won't question what the school says, understanding that that power dynamic might be there and leveraging it to ensure that their voice is still heard and still reciprocated in the communication. And again, adapting communication style to fit the family need. So if texting is the way, text. If emailing is the way, email. And do more than one if possible. Because again, we want to ensure that we're being as communicative as possible and that no one is feeling that they're not in the loop, if you will, around what is happening in their system. And so, as we transition out of really student morale boosting, how do we think about our staff? And as I said, we know a lot of you in here are administrators. And so you're wearing the hat of having to manage not only your staff, your students, but also your families and communities. And we've given you a lot on what to do with families and students. Staff is just as important. And I would argue, and I'm sure Dana would agree, you are just as important too. So, as we're giving you this last section around staff, see yourselves in this and what you can take from it to help support your efforts. And so, if any of you are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of the things that you'll see here may be reminiscent of that as we consider your thoughts, your actions, and your feelings, and how each of them really impact the other. So, these things all really impact our resiliency, our ability to bounce back, our willingness to be able to engage even when we're stressed, on how we can make ourselves feel stronger, but also acknowledge when we need a moment. And so, with that, think about your feelings. So, in your feeling space, what can you do? So, it could be reading, it could be journaling, it could be music. I know for me, music is my thing. I often say when I'm training around PBIS and a concept called neutralizing routines, when I need to take it down a notch, when I'm feeling really heightened, I hum a favorite song, and that tends to bring me down some. So that could be a feeling on how I manifest what I'm feeling, what's coming up in my body, and being able to use a skill to bring me down or to bring me some pause. Then I move into thoughts, which could be meditation. For some of us, it could be prayer. For some of us, it could just be taking a deep breath. All of those things are important. But also with our thoughts, how can we reframe maybe an incident or a comment and figure out, did I understand that correctly? What was the perspective of the other person? What's the lesson learned from that exchange or that interface? And what's my positive self-talk? So what can I do to take myself up to not feel like I'm taking things the wrong way, etc. And then actions are, what can I physically do to feel better in that moment and also long term. So this may be you're sleepy, you're exhausted, you need to just take a moment and take a siesta if you need to. If you need physical movement, getting out and getting some vitamin D, some sunshine, like today in Harrisburg, it's kind of nice today. So this might be a day to get out and do that. And also just sustaining yourself physically, whether that's by thirst or by hunger, nutritionally, how are you sustaining yourself? So those are main things that as we think of staff morale, these three things in those categories, what can you do to support yourself? I'll turn it over to Dana.
So I know Nicole and I really love this because it fits well into our background. And I know when she was talking, you may have think like, I'm going to take her example for of music. You may think, well, that's an action, like she's humming. And it's such a highlight of why these are a triangle. Like they go together. If you start doing something in an action, it affects your feelings and your thoughts. And so they really are a cycle. And so what we're going to present is thinking about how we move through this. You know, when we first started the pandemic, which was a year ago, we heard a lot about self-care, self-care, self-care. And self-care was like this woohoo thing out there that was like, and I heard so many times when I was talking about self-care, I can't do self-care. All the like the salons are closed. I can't get my hair done. I can't go here. I can't go there. And I want us to expand self-care to more than that. And so one of the reasons we picked this wheel from the Compassion Resilience Toolkit is because it does take you on that compassion resilience journey that Nicole talked about. How do we move forward and think about building a resilience, building a stress resilience to think, how do we maintain that non-anxious presence when we're experiencing stressors that occur throughout the day? Like we just can't avoid stress. It just doesn't go away. We can't control that. So how do we think about ourselves? And so I know for me, I talk about self-care all the time, and I'm not always the best at doing it. So one of the things I like about this wheel is that you can look at where you're not addressing your own self-care. What's causing you to feel that down and not able to rebound? So you can focus on that rather than this overwhelming thing of, oh my gosh, I have 10,000 things to do already. And now you want me to do self-care. I don't even know how to go about that. So the first one is strength. And this is really thinking about that stress resilience that I talked about and also the care for your body. So are we just taking care of our physical wellness? As Nicole said, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you drinking water? Are you doing things that physically take care of yourself? And the second area is heart. This is really considered a very private area of self-care. So this is not always something that we share in the workspace. And so you can think about, just because someone else shares it, don't feel that you have to share it. This is personal information. And we need to think about how we share that effectively. One of the things we talk about in the staff and student wellness guide is really having those check-ins, and check-ins relate to this heart area. They relate to the how am I doing? How are my emotions at this point? How do I feel like I'm able to manage? And when we share that in a professional setting, it's a balancing act of sharing how I feel, getting support, but not living in a venting stage where we don't solve the problem. We just continue to admire the problem. We need to remember that the professional setting is a professional setting. So we have to maintain those relationships. So how do we maintain them at a work setting? And then even, many of us have amazing friendships and relationships that we've developed through this work. And you can have different conversations outside the work setting than you have in the work setting, and making sure that you're balancing back and forth between the two. I'm thinking also about, how do you create relationships outside your work setting? How do you have positive relationships that really support who you are? And this isn't about a quantity of relationships. This is really about that quality. Whereas Nicole talked about being able to be your true, authentic self, these relationships are so important. You have to have relationships where you can be you, where you don't have to put on that front and feel like you're everything to everyone, and you have to be this superhero. I was looking for a neutral word and I lost it for a second. So really thinking about how you develop that and taking advantage of that so that you're able to have that back and forth. When we think about mind, this is our work in our organization. We spend so much time talking about the work we do. Like, we really spend a lot of time thinking about what we do. A lot of the times when I meet new people, the first question I've asked is, what do you do? We spend just a huge amount of time thinking about it. And we need to identify our purpose. So if we think about what we're really passionate about and what we feel like our mission in life is, and then we think about our job, and like our vocation, and we put them all together, this is our purpose. It's kind of the intersection of all of it. And we want to think about that because it allows us to feel fulfilled, and it allows us to maintain our morale when we are super stressed out and feeling like, I cannot even believe that I came into this field. And like, being 100% real, we know that turnover was a difficult thing before the pandemic. And then we added all this stress with the pandemic, and all of these things came on our plates, and you had to be educators, and you had to be parents, or you had to be caregivers of someone who was sick, and you had to deal with all the stresses that were happening, and you still had to take care of 20 to 40 little humans, or if you're in secondary, hundreds of little humans. And it became like this overwhelming amount of stress. And so what helps us get through that and move towards resiliency is those moments where we think about, why is this meaningful? How much do our relationships matter? The difference we're making in students' lives. And that is where our work in our organization and kind of the cognitive part that Nicole presented in the triangle really comes into play. And then the last part is spirit. What do we do daily, weekly, or monthly that renews ourselves? Like, how are we filling our cup or filling our bucket with energy? Do we really think about rest and play? Are we doing activities that rejuvenate us? Are we engaging in things that create that work-life balance and being able to find time to do that? And so one of the things I think about from my elementary school days is that bucket filler. And so I loved it when I found this one, because this is your mental wellness bucket. We always, think about bucket fillers and bucket dippers and think about which one causes which and how that matters. I love this one because there are plugs. So if we think about staff wellness and staff fillers, thinking about compliments, acknowledgement, what achievements do you do? Are you doing work that you love? These are all things that fill your professional mental wellness bucket. And those leaks are, people's actions or words, situations that go wrong, that student that you feel like you just cannot reach, the family that you're struggling to engage in, the administrator, or conversely for administrators, the staff that's just driving you crazy and you can't figure out how to build that relationship. So when there's another part, the plugs is what we do for ourselves. So we often talk about self-care, but we also want to talk about organizational self-care. So we'll put something in to chat that has some organizational self-care links, as well as everything that goes with the wheel that we just presented. But thinking about, as an organization, how do we create environments that make our staff feel safe and supported? How do we make sure that our staff feel heard? And how do we look at organizational self-care, which can be anything from, is my parking lot lighted when I go outside? Do I have appropriate heat and air in my classroom? Do I have paper for the copier? These are organizational self-care things as well. So really thinking about those plugs that add to our self-care and our mental wellness bucket.
So Dana, you went through the bucket, and I love that. I think it's such a great way of conceptualizing kind of how we feel a lot of times, and to reframe it to say, here's some plugs. Like, let's think about what we can do to fit in those holes is really important. I know you mentioned before there are quite a few resources that we put out for all of you, but one that I wanted Dana to really highlight is this first one, and it's Close Gap. I think it's really cool. So Dana, do you mind taking folks to that? And you're muted, by the way.
It's like the quote of 2021. Okay, so I'm putting Close Gap up here so you can see it. This is a free resource, and I always love free. So I love free coming in my personal life and when I'm presenting things, because free, and then when you combine it with research-based, I'm like in my very happy space. And so Close Gap looks at how students feel. So it's an emotional check-in. What is amazing about it is when you look at it, you create the system either for as an educator or parents. Obviously, we're looking at the educator one right now. But when you go to this and you sign your students up. And so what happens when they do their daily check-in, which you can do when Nicole talked about like that morning message and doing your personal check-ins, this can be one of those things that you do. They just click on how they're feeling. It is super simple. It is very user-friendly, and the parents and the educators get a graph. So how are we feeling? Am I noticing differences from one day to the next? This is especially important when we think about the students who are not those externalizing students. They're not the ones slamming their laptops down, walking away, saying, I'm not doing this. They're the quiet ones, the ones you may not see on camera, or they shut their camera off and they're there, but they're not interacting. They're the ones sitting in the back of the classroom and just seem down and don't have a lot of friends, and they're not interacting with you. Or the students who have experienced emotional or behavioral problems in the past, and we know they're having more difficulty now. This really gives you a way to keep data on how they are interpreting their feelings and emotions, and allows us to intervene early when things are going not the way we would want them to go.
Yeah, I just think that was such a cool, and you said free, you had me at free. So I'm sure there are many other people listening that really could take a tour through that and get more acclimated with it. The other one, Dana, if you don't mind highlighting, is compassion resilience for school leaders and staff. And as you're doing that, I'm putting these in the chat too. But I think these are a couple that you definitely want to know about.
So the Compassion Resilience Toolkit for school leaders and staff is a way of looking at how we move from compassion fatigue to compassion resilience. It has a facilitator's guide. I want to really highlight, if when you go in and explore this, there's only 12 modules. So you could think, oh, this is short and easy. This is a journey. Just like being an equitable trauma-informed system is a journey, building compassion resilience from compassion fatigue is also a journey. So this is really meant to do over 6 to 12 months. So thinking about your system and pausing to make sure you're addressing each area. When you go into it, it does have the areas that we talked about. It has system drivers of compassion fatigue. And it really builds out. What I love about it for school systems is it has a facilitator guide. Everything is there. So if you want to do this as a staff, it is not adding one more thing where you're like, great, here's a general idea, and now I'm going to go find resources and I'm going to build in the activities and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. It is completely built for you. And they present compassion fatigue in a grumpy cat cycle. So really, that's just an amusing part that a lot of staff going through it really enjoy, just because it does add some humor in thinking about how we can address compassion.
Excellent. So, as I said, there are a number of resources that you will have in your PowerPoint handout that we definitely recommend you take some time around and see what fits you best. Some other ones that come directly from PDE, I know I can speak to this. Dana has put a lot of great work into the self care resources. So, please take time and go through them, as well as promoting positive learning climates online and at home, since we're talking about all these different mechanisms of delivering instruction. And then our staff and student wellness guide. If you've not seen that, definitely take some time and go through that one to just give some information or some guidance around how you can even start your school year back up, some things to keep in mind. There's checklists there, there's resources that are embedded within it. So definitely take some time and go through these resources.